Serene is the author of Adaptive Preferences and Women's Empowerment, which came out from Oxford University in 2011, if you guys want to check it out. She's now working on a book on transnational feminist solidarity. I really would like to read it,
and I have to finish writing. But it has a contract now, so it will happen. Thank you very much to Sumru and to John for organizing this and for inviting me, and special thanks to Sumru for not just being willing to respond to, but for being willing to respond to a kind of mess of a paper that I sent her a week ago. I want to say a little bit of something about the genesis of this paper and why I picked it before I actually start talking about it. So I'm a philosopher. Philosophy is like a very stodgy discipline. I don't know to what extent you guys are sort of aware of that. And I'm bringing that up because no, this paper is going to be like the stodgiest version of myself, because the reason, the actual kind of professional genesis of it is that somebody asked me to contribute to this volume about respect that has like the most famous people and like the mainstream of the profession in it. So I was kind of like, how do I sneak these concerns about agency under conditions of oppression that I'm used to writing about into a language that very sort of mainstream analytic philosophers will understand. So I just want to explain to you why, both kind of why I'm going to deliver a paper that's in this format, but also to invite you to talk about the broader issues. Like my work is mostly about agency under conditions of oppression and women in the global South. So and these guys invited me because they'd seen me give a paper about Saba Mahmood. So if you, I'm going to try to actually keep this particular paper short, and then I really want you guys to feel willing to ask me like a very wide range of questions when we get into the Q&A. Oh, and the other reason I chose this, besides that I was working on it, I will say, is that I had found in writing this paper that I had really felt like part of the answer to the question I was interested in lay in Lisa Tessman's recent book about moral failure. So there is a kind of thematic reason that I ended up with this paper and not other papers that I have written, which is that, I'm just going to set a timer for myself, but which is that moral failure, she has recently written this book about moral failure. A lot of people have started paying attention to it. And I really started to think that it might be useful in kind of understanding the phenomenology of why people perpetuate oppressive norms. So with that said, I'll just get into the content of the paper. So what I'm going to try to show here, and this is kind of written at the part of your handout that says the thesis, is that claims that oppressed agents fail themselves by complying with oppressive norms require the mistaken assumption that it's blameworthy for a person to pursue her own welfare. And then I want to say that if Lisa Tessman is right, and we can move beyond the moral language of praise and blame, and think about the possibility that moral failure is not avoidable sometimes, we can maybe talk in a sensible way about the idea that oppressed agents fail when we perpetuate our own oppression without blaming them for perpetuating their own oppression. That's kind of what I'm interested in thinking about. So to just kind of motivate the problem for you a little bit, so now I'm going to go to your Roman numeral 1. One thing I think is pretty evident even in like the feminist movement and in pop cultural depictions of feminism is that feminism, especially in sort of the last 30 years, has a real sort of preoccupation with like trying to prevent women from feeling shame, blame, the feeling that they have failed. And so the paper that I gave to Sumru began with a bunch of quotes, but I think about like how when I was a kid and I read The Beauty Myth, like it ends with this comment, like, can I not wear lipstick without feeling guilty? And then I was also thinking about how in like Melissa Harris Perry's book, she talks a lot about how the real problem with the strong black woman stereotype is that it causes people to end up feeling shame and as though they have failed. So there seems to be this preoccupation in feminism with this worry about women feeling that they've failed and kind of wanting to prevent women from having to feel that they failed. So I see that as a preoccupation, but I think that part of the reason the preoccupation is there is that there is like a phenomenological reality to the feeling that one has failed when one perpetuates one's own oppression. And so I'm about to offer an account that ends up saying, no, perpetuating your oppression is often genuinely the best thing you can do, but it is also something, like there is something real that you are responding to when you feel like you have failed. I think that the reason that feminists have been preoccupied with trying to say that we don't fail is, as I have said, that they want women not to blame themselves. So what I ultimately want to say here is that we can talk about having failed without blaming ourselves. Before we go there, I'm going to spend kind of the first chunk of the paper arguing against a set of arguments that have become really popular in feminist philosophy. And these are arguments that say we have a self-regarding duty to resist oppression. So what that means is basically that oppressed agents, we fail ourselves if we don't resist oppression. So we have failed in some kind of a moral obligation if we don't resist. And what I want to say about the three arguments to that effect that I'm going to canvass is just that they are based on really mistaken social theoretical assumptions. So these arguments all kind of say, not just that an agent who is oppressed when she perpetuates her oppression is doing something morally wrong, but at the end of the day, they end up saying that the agent is doing something that is bad for her welfare when she complies with an oppressive norm. And what I want to end up saying is that the idea that you harm yourself when you comply with an oppressive norm is based on a mistaken understanding of what oppression is, and specifically the fact that oppression is a social phenomenon that afflicts groups. So I'm going to move to your Roman numeral 2, and I'm going to briefly, because I think this audience will probably need to hear less of this than a standard philosophy audience needs to hear. But I'm going to briefly say what I think two important social theoretical facts about oppression are that I think end up undercutting the claim that we harm ourselves when we comply with oppressive norms. So the first social theoretical fact that I think these theories miss is what I have at your Roman numeral 2a, and that is, and actually just so you know, I think I have it, do I have a definition of oppression on here? I don't, okay. So I just want to say before I keep going, the definition of oppression that I'm working with is the one that Marilyn Frye develops that essentially says that a social system is oppressive if it includes a system of norms and practices that disadvantage members of one social group relative to another social group. So that's what I think oppression is. I think two important facts fall out of the fact that it's a group afflicting phenomenon, and I think that many of these arguments that we have a self-regarding duty to resist miss these facts. So the first one is what I have at your Roman numeral 2a, and that's the fact that I'm calling the variegation of the public. The basic idea here is that oppression creates social groups. Part of what happens in these social groups is that they develop shared perspectives on the social world. So a social group is not just a group of people. I don't think I have to tell you guys that. I have to sometimes tell philosophers that. But part of what's important, oh, you're laughing. You would be surprised. It's not just a group of people. It is a group of people, or the feature that's going to be important here is that the social group is likely to share an internal perspective on the world, and if the group is marginalized, its view of the world is likely to have counter-hegemonic content. That's all I'm trying to get out of the variegation of the public. I think you guys probably all already know this. Philosophers don't know it, so I'm not going to belabor it more, but the only idea from it that I need is that there is not just one set of shared understandings in society. There are multiple sets of shared understandings, and the sets of shared understandings of oppressed people are particularly likely to contain a critique of the injustice of the social order. So that's the first kind of social theoretical fact that I think that these arguments for a self-regarding duty to resist miss. And I'm on your second page where it says general mitigating effect. I just want to point out that what I'm going to end up taking from this fact about the variegation of the public is just that if one is a member of a social group, an oppressed social group where counter-hegemonic understandings circulate, one mitigating effect that that can have on harm to the oppressed agent is that she likely has access to a critical understanding of her own oppression if she circulates with other members of her group. Because a lot of these arguments that oppressed agents, that oppression makes the lives of oppressed agents so terrible, function on this understanding that you must internalize your oppression if you're subject to it. One of the things that I want to suggest kind of pushes against that point is that if you function inside of a counterpublic, you are likely to have access to forms of meaning that suggest that your oppression is not acceptable, or that what white people think is not the truth about the world, or what men think isn't the truth about the world, something like that. So that's the first social theoretical fact about oppression that I think these arguments that we have a duty to resist miss. The second social theoretical fact that they miss, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this, is what I call the incentivization of oppressive norm compliance. So my basic idea here is that objective benefits often accrue to members of oppressed groups when they perpetuate their own oppression. And I'm going to say something kind of stronger about that, which is that perpetuating one's own oppression is often the most welfare maximizing option in an agent's set. So to kind of anticipate my worry about some of these arguments that say we have a self-regarding duty to resist, they largely seem to be premised on the idea that you undermine your own welfare when you comply with an oppressive norm. So you just need to see that you are undermining your own welfare. Once you notice it, then your reason for perpetuating your oppression will collapse, and then we will stop oppression from happening. What I want to say is that it is the case that the way that society is structured is such that not just material and social advantages accrue to oppressed agents because they comply with oppressive norms, and that often it is the very most welfare maximizing thing they can do to comply. So I'm going to give you sort of one example of that here that's very schematic, and it's about a philosopher speaking, a woman who's a philosopher who wants to speak for equal time in her department meeting, but sort of consistently with norms about gender and communication. She knows that if she speaks for as long as a man speaks, people are likely to stop listening to her and think that she is an overly aggressive communicator. So before I go into the example, just to tell you sort of what one way of conceiving how it might be the case that complying with oppressive norms is often the most welfare maximizing thing to do. One way of analyzing it, if you want to, is to analyze it as a collective action problem. So you can, I think a simple way to think about this is to think, I don't think it's the only way to think about it, but is to think about oppressed agents as facing a coordination or stag hunt problem wherein everybody would benefit from the oppressive norm going away, but every individual agent has an incentive not to upend the norm. And so unless you can build trust among women and engage in collective action to upend the norm, at the end of the day, what is likely to happen is that individual agents are likely to end up perpetuating the norm for reasons that are self-interested. So to give you kind of a sense of how that works with this example, we can have this person who is trying to speak in her department meeting. She wants to talk for as long as a man so that she'll be heard. However, she also knows that if she talks for as long as a man, she is likely to, be thought she'd lose favor with her colleagues, to be thought to be aggressive, and so on. I have this matrix on your second page. All that I want to show with the matrix is just that the extent to which this norm obtains in her life is not in her control, right? So the extent to which she is going to be judged by this norm that says women who speak too much are aggressive is not something she can upend with her own action, right? Like, she has to treat as fixed the fact that she is going to be judged according to this standard. And if she has to treat that as fixed, I mean, assuming that, like, you know, she's not in a room full of feminists that are all going to stop the men in the room from evaluating her according to the standard or something. She has to treat this norm as fixed and then choose the best option among the available options. And so if she can't do, and if her complying with the norm does not cause her to be evaluated according to this norm, and if her not complying with the norm doesn't stop her from being evaluated according to this norm, all that's in her control is like how much she is going to be heard in a world where these norms obtain. And so if I'm right about that, part of what that means is that it's in her best interests to not speak for as long as a man speaks because of the sacrifices of professional credibility she will be likely to incur afterwards. Or another thing she could try to do is, you know, to find like a stealth way to introduce her idea, but in order for it to work, it's going to have to not violate the norm, right? So she might like secretly convince her male colleague that her idea was his idea, and then somebody will will listen to her idea. But at the end of the day, her way, like her best bet for getting heard is not to violate the norm, and her best bet for maintaining professional credibility is not to violate the norm. So what I want to say about this fact that it's often the most welfare maximizing thing an oppressed agent can do to perpetuate her oppression, is that this also kind of punches a hole in these arguments that say you undermine your welfare when you comply with oppressive norms, right? Like, no, it might be, and I think it often is, that you are doing objectively the best thing that is available for you to do when you comply with oppressive norms. And I want to kind of pause and say one other thing about this idea, because some people worry that when I offer this analysis, I'm now saying that oppression isn't bad, right? Because I'm saying that if you comply with an oppressive norm, you're not worsening your own situation. I think all we have to say to make sense of that is just that, no, like, what oppression does is disadvantage groups relative to each other, so it's totally consistent to be able to say that an oppressed agent is doing the best she can do under this group disadvantaging situation when she perpetuates her oppression. At the end of the day, we can still analyze oppression as a negative social phenomenon because a man doesn't face this deficient option set. Okay. So now that I have kind of listed these two sort of social theoretical facts about oppression that I think arguments that say we have a duty to resist miss, I'm going to very briefly sort of canvass these three arguments that are out there and very popular right now saying that we have a self-regarding duty to resist and explaining what I think is wrong with them. The first one, so I'm at your Roman numeral 3A, comes from Bernard Boxall, and he is writing about cases of servility. And basically what he says is that if you are, and he specifically, his examples have to do with African Americans, and the example that he repeatedly uses is like the example of an Uncle Tom living in like the 19th century. And he basically says, like, yes, you might live in a world where there are incentives for you to be servile, but you have to, at least once in your life, point out to people that you do not accept this servile treatment. Because if you don't, the danger is that you will never know what you really care about. So you can imagine that you can have a private meeting with yourself where you really don't believe in your oppression, but you keep complying with oppressive norms. And then he wants to say, well, private meeting isn't possible. What you need is not just to feel that you are self-respecting, but to have your self-respecting witnessed by others in order for your self-respect to be genuine. Basically what my problem with that in a 2-second version is that I think it misses the fact of the variegation of the public. So it suggests that only people in dominant groups, so I'm willing to actually buy that you might have to have your self-respecting acts witnessed in order for them to count as self-respecting. I think it is probably a weird theory of meaning to say that you can be, by yourself having these thoughts and these thoughts are the truth on your own. But I don't understand why Boxall assumes that you have to, like, that only the oppressor can witness you, right? Like, so, I just think that this argument misses the variegation of the public. Part of the function that, like, these counterpublics serve for people is precisely to, to allow people to engage in behavior that reads as, that is oppression perpetuating, that reads as servile to members of the dominant group, and that at the same time members of the subordinate group are capable of reading as done for instrumental reasons, or even like done with a secret like bad tinge under them that just wasn't legible to people in the dominant group. So that's sort of my 2-second problem with Boxall's argument. A second argument, which is getting a lot of attention right now, comes from Carol Hay. So I'm at your Roman numeral 3b. Hay argues that oppressive norm compliance causes akrasia. So if you don't know what akrasia is, it's the Greek word for weakness of will. So when you, no, maybe this is the funny thing about this. Like, I was scared that I was going to bring it here and everyone was just going to be like, wow, philosophy is crazy. So yeah, I mean, this is probably the most kind of like shocking of the arguments that I'm going to describe. But her thought is that, or Hay's thought is that one of the things that happens to you if you repeatedly comply with oppressive norms is just that, like, you get so used to complying that now even when you don't want to comply, you end up complying anyway. So weakness of will in general in moral philosophy is like a situation in which you want to act in a certain way, but you can't act in the way that you say that you want to act. Somewhat troublingly, one of, like, Hay's main example of this is women who consent to unwanted sex because they, quote, cannot see how to say no. And it's unclear in the actual text whether she's just trying to say that some small subset of women consents to unwanted sex for this reason, or if she's trying to say that this is a common or general reason that women consent to unwanted sex. But I want to point out that I think her argument has to hang on her saying the second thing, because if it's going to be an obligation to resist oppression, this has to be a thing that happens frequently in cases of oppression, right? Like, it can't just be something that happens like 5 times people were oppressed, this thing happened to them, and now a general obligation to resist oppression comes out of it. So, I'm going to read her as saying, for the purposes of this 2-minute version, that a common reason that women consent to unwanted sex is that they can't see how to say no. And then if that's right, I mean, if that's what she thinks, then I just think that this ignores the incentivization of oppressive norm compliance. That plenty of times women have, and there's lots of empirical data to support this, that like women have welfare maximizing reasons to consent to unwanted sex, including, and I cite Nicola Gaby's work in here because I think it's really interesting. She's not the only person who talks about this, but including now there's lots of evidence that women consent to unwanted sex because they don't want to be raped. So it seems like if you're consenting to unwanted sex because you don't want to be a victim of rape, there is a story to be told about that is not that you don't want, like, that a story to be told about that doesn't say that you are mistaken about your welfare, right? That you just, like, you're mistaken about whether you want this sexual activity. It seems like you are aware that you do not desire this sexual activity, but the other option that is available in the case where you're going to consent to unwanted sexual activity so as not to be raped is a worse option, so you're picking the better option that's available in your set. So I think, Hay wants to say, look, you wrong yourself when you consent, when you perpetuate your own oppression because you turn yourself into this kind of person who can't act on reasons that they recognize as reasons. And I want to say that actually I think what's probably more common in these cases is that when you comply with oppressive norms, you are acting on reasons that you recognize as reasons. They're just the reasons that you have in a second best world, right? So like, you know that the option of not having, like, in the world that you live in, there is no option in which you can only have sex with people you want to have sex with. in that world, you would act on a reason where you only consented to have sex with people you wanted to have sex with. The world that you actually live in is not structured like that. You may find yourself in a situation where your only two options are to consent to unwanted sex and to be raped. And then I think there's nothing inconsistent if you live in that second world between saying, I don't want to be a rape victim, or I think women should not have to consent to unwanted sex, and consenting to unwanted sex in this case. I don't think that the agent is contradicting herself in any way if she does that. And I think, we can talk about this more in the Q&A. I think we make choices like this every day, once we start thinking about it. Not always necessarily about unwanted sex, but I think once you start thinking about the phenomenology of why you comply with the oppressive norms you comply with if you're a member of an oppressed group, I think my experience is that this ends up resonating with people a lot. Okay, so then there's a third argument that says that we have a self-regarding duty to resist, and that's the one from Daniel Silverman, which comes at your 3C. He says, and I'm just going to focus on what's your 3CA, the oppressive norm, so Silverman's going to say you have a duty to pursue your own welfare. Complying with oppressive norms is a failure of that duty. And then his explanation of why it's a failure is that in order to pursue your own welfare, you have to pursue goals that are genuinely your own. And then essentially he ends up saying, oh, when you comply with oppressive norms, or this is one way of reading him, when you comply with oppressive norms, what you do is you end up pursuing the goals of the oppressor rather than the goals of your own, because keeping the oppressive system intact is not really your goal, it's the goal of members of the oppressor group. So I'm going to kind of make the same criticism of that view, which is that I also think it ignores the incentivization of oppressive norm compliance. So I think there's a simple story to be told, similar to the one that I told about Hay, which is that you can have your own, okay, under non-ideal conditions under which your options are limited, you can still have your own goals. Doing the best that you can do under these conditions can be a goal that counts as your own, right? Otherwise, the danger of this kind of view, if you say the opposite thing, is that oppressed agents just can't have their own goals, or the only thing that would count as a goal for oppressed agents is for them to sacrifice their welfare. Because, that's actually, I think, the dangerous place where this keeps going, where this ends up going if you assert the opposite, is that if you say you aren't pursuing your own goals, if you pursue the ends of the oppressor, well, then what happens when you don't pursue the ends of the oppressor? Well, often something very bad is going to happen to you if you don't pursue the ends of the oppressor. And so what ends up happening if you say that acts that perpetuate your oppression can't be your own, is that you end up saying that what you are obligated to do if you act in a way that pursues your own ends is essentially to sacrifice your welfare to make this statement about kind of how you don't endorse the goals of the oppressor. Okay, so that is kind of those are these three arguments that are out there that say that we have a self-regarding duty to resist oppression. To kind of summarize what I think is wrong with all of them is all of these arguments say that oppressed agents make their lives worse with respect to welfare when they comply with oppressive norms. I think that view is mistaken. I think it's mistaken because it misses the ways in which group membership and the incentivization of oppressive norm compliance structure the welfare effects of complying with oppressive norms. And so underneath it all, then, my worry about this kind of argument, the types of arguments that the people who say we have a self-regarding duty to resist are advancing, my worry is that those arguments, if they were to acknowledge that it is welfare maximizing to comply with oppressive norms, would end up having to say to the oppressed agent, you have a duty not to pursue your own welfare. You have a duty, what it is morally right for you to do is for you to sacrifice your own well-being at the altar of some kind of grandstanding about, the state of women or the state of people of color, because that's the only way you can sort of maintain your self-respect. So Then my worry, and this is where kind of the conversation about failure starts to come in, it seems like feminists should definitely want to avoid that conclusion, right? Like we should want to avoid the conclusion that it is wrong for oppressed people to pursue their own welfare. Like it would be an extremely burdensome goal and obligation to place on people who are already oppressed, that now they need to give up their own well-being on top of experiencing oppression in order to make some kind of a statement. So if these arguments all end in the claim that it's wrong to pursue your own welfare, then I think what they come close to doing is advocating victim blaming. So now I feel like, and this is where the work about moral failure is going to come in, but then I think that there really is a puzzle, because I think a lot of people, and I have experienced this a lot in people's negative reactions to my work, because I'm a person who is like always kind of stumping for like oppressed people are making smart choices most of the time, other people just can't read them, whatever. People have this negative reaction, and I think that the reason, I'm coming to see that part of the reason that they have this negative reaction is that it makes it, my view looks sanguine to them, right? Like that, yeah, at the end of the day, you can go home when you are an oppressed person who complies with oppressive norms routinely, and you should just kind of sit down and be happy with your life because you did the best that you can do. And I think that the people who are, if that's the impulse that people who are objecting to me have, I actually think there's something to that being a problem, right? Because I think it seems like it is phenomenologically true that many of us still feel bad in some way for complying with oppressive norms, even if we know that it was the best thing we could do. And so this is a place, and I said I picked this paper because it ends by talking about failure, so here's where I'm going to talk about failure. What Lisa Tessman is trying to suggest in her book about moral failure is that it is possible and we should have moral theory that talks about situations in our life where failure is inevitable. And I'm going to explain her theory in a moment here, but to tell you kind of something about the logical move that that's going to help us make, if the failure is inevitable, we can say at the same time that you failed and that you are not blameworthy for failing, right? Like, if there was no non-failing option available to you in your set, we can say like, oh, you did the best thing that was available for you to do, and not blame you. And at the same time, maybe we can do justice to your having a type of moral experience in which you still feel like something, like your agency has gone into something wrong when you have complied with oppressive norms. So now I'm at your Roman numeral 4a, and honestly, the stuff about moral failure is the part that I'm like the least sure about. I just thought this conference would be kind of a fun place to throw it out since you guys say you're thinking about failure. So Lisa Tessman argues that there are some moral situations that create inevitable failure. And she describes those as situations that create what she calls genuinely dilemmatic moral conditions. And so what it means if the conditions are dilemmatic is that either option that you choose will require you to violate a moral requirement that it is impermissible to violate. It's the impermissible to violate thing is important because what standard moral theories are going to say about situations where you have, you have two bad options is, well, find the one that's worse. Don't do the worst one, and now you're fine. But then, from a philosophical perspective, the situation is then just not really genuinely dilemmatic, right? Like, there are two bad options, one is worse than the other, so you're still doing the right thing when you pick the better one. Tessman wants to say there are situations in which there are moral requirements which you should never violate, and both of the options available to you require you to violate such an obligation. So she draws on work by Bernard Williams to explain this, and I'll just give the example that Williams gives, even though Tessman is more interested in theorizing about oppression. Williams gives the example of like how you might feel after you ran over somebody with your car on accident. he says that part of what you would, and just to, there's some reason that you ran over the person on accident, like that you really were not in control. And so what he wants to say about that situation is that you still probably feel regret that you ran over this person. And he wants to say moral theories that are just focused on whether you chose the best option in your set can't explain why you still feel regret, right? Like, because if regret were the kind of thing that only attaches to like, did you do the best thing you can do? Oh, then don't regret it. It can't explain why there's all of these kinds of situations in life where we did the best thing that was possible and we still regret it. And so that's his example. So Tessman says, kind of drawing on Williams, that the phenomenology of this kind of experience, of being faced with these genuinely dilemmatic moral conditions, is that you're left with something that she calls a moral remainder, which is this feeling that you have failed, despite the fact that you couldn't do better. And her important point about this is that, so what we need moral theory to do is to witness the failure. Like, being repeatedly told that, you did the best you can do, stop feeling bad, is actually a way of, she thinks, denying the moral experience of people who have gone through oppression and trauma. So she has this quote that I really love, so I have it kind of under Roman numeral 4. She says, we want a normative theory that can, quote, witness and evaluate the particular moral experience that lies in the gap between a non-ideal world and what is unattainable but worthy. So part of what she's saying is that our existing language for moral theorizing, is almost serving this kind of ideological function, in the sense that it's great at explaining what people do when their situations are not terrible. But when your situation is terrible and you are faced with two really bad options, our moral theory is actually not doing what it's supposed to do, in that it's telling you should celebrate something that is experienced as morally, terrible for you. So now I want to move to your Roman numeral 4b and just ask really briefly, I'm going to turn off this timer before it goes off, and ask whether we can think about oppressive norm compliance as meeting the standards for what Tessman calls dilemmatic moral conditions. So one way I think we might be able to do it, and this is just kind of a question that I have, is if we could say that we have two sort of inviolable moral requirements, each of us in our own lives, and one is to promote our own welfare, and another one is to promote our own equal status. Because the problem of oppression is that it forces those two things to come apart, right? You have to repeatedly promote your unequal status in order to get your own welfare. If we are obligated to pursue both of those things, then you could make a case that what oppression does is face agents with dilemmatic moral conditions, right? Conditions under which the choice is always welfare or self-respect. You have to choose one, but you should never have to choose one of these things. You should always be able to pursue both of these things. So I'm wondering if that's right, if that can explain something about this phenomenology of why we might feel like we have failed when we comply with oppressive norms. Is that we know on some level that what we are owed is the ability to sort of express both our sense of our own equal standing and our ability to pursue a life that we think is meaningful, interesting, flourishing. We know that we're owed both of these things, and we want to be able to express them in action. We want to be able to act in ways that cause other people to see, both I am equal to you and grant us access to the types of social benefits that relationships are often gatekeepers for. So yeah, I just want to kind of end on that question about whether that account can help us do justice to the phenomenology of the experience of how oppressed people may feel about complying with oppressive norms. And one thing I really like about it is that if it does do justice to that phenomenology, it does it without victim blaming, because it doesn't say, it begins from an acknowledgement that the oppressed agent still did the best thing she could do. and at the same time says, but it makes sense for you to feel that you have failed. So I think I will stop there. I want to say actually before we go into Sumeri's comments, just that I want to reiterate that people should really feel free to ask me kind of any kinds of questions that have to do in general with agency under conditions of oppression, because I know this paper was maybe a little bit more technical than I would have liked it to be, but it ended, because it was about failure, I wanted to bring it here. But thank you.
Thank you.